Morning, everyone. Everyone hear me okay? All right, great. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mason Ailstock. I'm the president of the Rowen Foundation, and it's a pleasure to have you all with us here on this beautiful campus, a beautiful fall morning coming together, talking about a very important issue that faces all of us, the intersection of climate and the environment and public health. And how do we first recognize, address, and take on those challenges both today and in looking to the future. So we're gonna have a great conversation ahead of us. Before we jump in, I do want to take a moment to recognize any elected officials that are here, local or state officials, and just thank them for their service, their leadership in helping to guide our communities. I know they work tirelessly as a part of Georgia and our local environment. I want to recognize members of our board. Some are here, some will be joining us here in a little bit. Our chairman, Sachin Salendra, Provost Jack Hugh from the University of Georgia, Sam Hinton, who's here, thank you. Bert Reeves from Georgia Tech, Arthur Tripp, a former congressional advisor in DC, and of course, our wonderful host, Dr. Deb Bruner, Senior Vice President for Research here at Emory. We have a fantastic board. I'm gonna give them a round of applause. And Dr. Jan Joseph, I apologize, President of George Gwinnett College. Our board is fantastic. And without the leadership, the support around the foundation from our board of directors, we really would not be able to do all of the great work that we have underway as a part of the foundation. And then I also want to recognize Rowen's staff that is here. Christina DiGiulio, and some of these folks may have stepped out, I see here in the back, Tanner Dudley, Will Finkelstein and Miriam Dominguez, all wonderful leaders as a part of the foundation, helping us to make today possible, but as well as creating a project that really is about the future and multiple generations. And that's really where we are. Rowen is a 2,000-acre multi-generational project that is focused on sustainability, the environment, and how we can create a place that is first and foremost about people, diverse people coming together with different experiences, backgrounds, perspectives, resources in order to take on those global challenges that are ahead of us, and creating a culture of convergence where those industries, those institutions intersect and overlap. I believe that's where we find solutions. That's where we find new ideas, new businesses, new products, new data points that help to inform the work that we do together, and in many ways help us to think about and recognize the questions that we don't even know what to ask yet. But we only get to that by building a culture where people can come together and have an environment to ask questions, to test ideas, to challenge each other, and then to find a consensus and be able to move forward in partnership. The foundation's programmatic drivers are around agriculture, medicine, and the environment, and the countless enabling technologies that really bind them together, like AI and robotics, biotech, life science, precision agriculture. All of these areas intertwine and converge with agriculture, medicine, and the environment, and guide our thinking and how we engage with industry, but also how we develop the property. And I'd mentioned site certification, the U.S. Green Building Council, third-party verification of doing a development that is in a responsible manner, that's thinking about 100% green renewable energy, that's thinking about applying broadband connectivity to our infrastructure, a complete streets design with trails and unique stormwater management solutions. So we want Rowen to be a living laboratory for the environment, for medicine, for agriculture, as well as a place where companies and our institutions come together to collaborate and use Rowen as that laboratory as well. Over the next 30 years, I keep saying multi-generational, it's a project that over the next many decades, we will be curating a community on this 2,000 acres. We are not transacting on real estate. We're bringing people in, we're inviting those partnerships to help us create this place that really is future focused in the work that we do. We will be breaking ground in December on the first $25 million worth of infrastructure that has that complete streets design and site certification. It'll be taking place over the next 15 months. In parallel with that, we'll be working with a number of industries and others to look for opportunities for vertical development as a part of the site, and be well on our way. So there's an exciting road ahead. But again, I always want to bring it back to people and the hands and the minds that really bring Rowen to life. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Deb Bruner to provide a few comments on behalf of Emory, and then we will dive into the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mason. I am thrilled on behalf of Emory to welcome all of you and to see so many Rowen board members here today. And Mason, thank you for this partnership and allowing us to show off a little bit in this beautiful building and host you all today. The critical changes and the pace of change in the environment enhances the urgency of this conversation and our collaborative work to tackle these issues for the health of our environment and the health of our global population. The partnership between Rowen and Emory University and among all the universities in Georgia will help to drive research and innovation to new heights in Georgia and the Southeast while creating more opportunities for students and our next generation of leaders. Emory has accomplished and committed to many cutting-edge research, innovation, and action activities, and are having an impact today. We have reached new heights with $944 million in research funding in FY22, and we're headed to $1 billion. A significant portion of that is related to climate health and to population health. Emory's been Atlanta's #1 largest employer for the last 3 years. And we've generated $14.8 billion in statewide economic impact. In addition, the provost has recently committed to funding a large faculty climate change initiative over the next 3 years. In addition to that, we've had a very long-standing and nationally recognized action initiatives around resilience and sustainability and lead the way for many universities. Emory researchers are working locally, regionally, and globally on issues related to climate change and public health, including air and water quality, and so much more. We have just had an Emory delegation, we're so proud of them, at COP this year at the climate change talks in Egypt, led by Dr. Ari Sakawa and a cohort of Emory students who there led in Egypt a conversation among students about climate change and climate action. And so clearly we have overlapping interests with Rowen and those interests and those interested in climate change. I'd like now to introduce our illustrious panel. You have their write-ups in those pamphlets in front of you, so I'm going to be brief. I'm going to start with Dr. Cassandra Quave, Associate Professor of Dermatology, Human Health, and Curator of the Herbarium at Emory University. You may want to join us now as I introduce you. She's a writer, speaker, podcast host, professor, explorer, and ethnobotanist. She leads an anti-infective drug discovery research initiatives and teaches courses in medicinal plants, food, and health. And as a leader in the field of medical botany, she holds 7 patents and has authored more than 100 scientific publications. Our next illustrious speaker, Dr. Marshall Shepard, the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Sciences and Geography and Director of the Atmospheric Sciences Program, Professor in the Department of Geography and Associate Director of Climate Science and Outreach at the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems at the University of Georgia. He was the 2013 president of the American Meteorologic Society, and prior to academia spent 12 years as a scientist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and was deputy project scientist on the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, which I don't know anything about, but I would love to hear. It sounds really fascinating. In 2021, he was elected to the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And then finally, our next illustrious speaker, Jonathan Beals, meteorologist and weather producer, the Weather Company and IBM. Jonathan is a meteorologist and weather producer for the Weather Company and IBM, and he produces forecast and storytelling graphics and articles for the Weather Channel app and for weather.com, plus social media and Española. So welcome to our panelists. I'm going to pose a series of questions to our panelists today, and look forward to your answers and insights, and then we would love to have some input from the audience. So our first question today is, what issues are top of mind for you as you think about the impacts of climate change on public health? And Cassie, I'm going to push this one to you.
Great. Well, I'm here to speak for the plants and people's relationships with plants, right? I think that some of the biggest issues at top of mind for me are really the impact that climate change is going to have on our food systems. You may have seen in the news, we just reached 8 billion people across this planet this week. I think we're going to have greater and greater challenges, not only in agriculture, but also in aquaculture, with changing water temperatures and also with the acidification of our oceans. So that's one concern. How do we continue to feed a world of this size? I also spoke with members of the Emory Climate Task Force and the Emory Offices of Sustainability and asked for their feedback, so I can also speak for them. And some of the key points that they brought up were issues with climate anxiety, which I think is something that especially is important for our students. And also some of the challenges that we're facing with heat, access to energy, access to water, and also the impacts of these storms and how storms, for example, Hurricane Ian flooded my hometown just a few weeks ago. And so we had introduction of all sorts of parasites and infectious pathogens that people are being exposed to. So I think that the challenges that we're facing are really, there's an entire spectrum of them. And we need a cross-disciplinary approach to really address these.
Thank you. The next question, Jonathan, is for you. What impact do the additional extremes in weather events in a warmer world, say that a couple times fast, warmer world pose for global public health and well-being, physical as well as mental?
I think Dr. Quave hit on one of the points with food shortages. And we're going to have, with different changes in weather, we're going to have different shortages. I think one of the things that is top of mind right now is housing shortages. And I think with hurricanes recently, we're talking about communities literally up and down the east coast of Florida that just got hit by the hurricane, where dozens of residents or hundreds of residents are now being told, wait, you can't go into your house anymore because this condo may end up in the Atlantic. That's one thing that is changing. The other thing that's changing is that we're learning with a warmer world, rainfall is becoming more prevalent. Storms are producing more rainfall as they're occurring. So that's one thing that you also mentioned we're talking about more bacteria, more mold. Several hurricanes now, we're looking in Fort Myers now, where we're having mold issues. So we're gonna have more of that. And that's not just at the coast where we're talking about hurricanes, but we also had a hurricane a couple of years ago end up dumping a ton of water in New York City. And they had the highest rainfall rates that they had ever seen in New York City. And there's all sorts of issues there. And then talking on mental health, another thing that you talked about, there is a lot of anxiety. We were talking to residents. One of the things that I get to do in my position is we get to talk to residents on the ground, talking before hurricanes, after hurricanes, and all sorts of weather events. And in Florida, every afternoon for 6 months of the year, you get daily thunderstorms. That is something that you were just used to. You kind of plan your day knowing that there's going to be a thunderstorm at some point during your day. Well, after the hurricane, all of a sudden, these people are afraid of these thunderstorms because they went through this massive hurricane, and all of a sudden there's thunder and there's wind. Oh my gosh, there's going to be another hurricane, is their first thought. And of course, we go back to housing. We're dealing with that shortage, and that becomes an anxiety. Where am I going to live? Where are my kids going to live? Is it safe to live here anymore? So there's a huge intersection between changing storms, changing climate, and public health.
Thank you. Okay, Marshall, what current research is inspiring you? It would be good to hear the upside of all of what we've just heard. So what current research is inspiring you and offering hope that we can work collaboratively to tackle these complex interwoven challenges impacting the health of our natural environment and the health of our global community?
Well, thank you for that question, first of all, and thank you to the board and also everyone at Rowen and Provost Hugh at UGA. I represent the University of Georgia, which is the state's land grant and sea grant university. So we have an inherent mission to focus on teaching, research, and service. And climate change really represents the nexus of where our mission at the University of Georgia can come to bear. Before I answer that question, I do want to actually add to what was stated in the previous two questions, because I want to talk about climate risk and vulnerability. I want to give you three phrases or words: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And where I'm going with that is many of these extreme weather events that are happening because of climate change, and we have to erode the use of the term going to happen or will happen. It's happening, it's here. And so our most vulnerable parts of our communities, communities of color, poor communities, children, I think we got a little scrape here, and as well as kids are most vulnerable. And so we have to think about the fact that when we have these hurricanes, when we have these floods or these droughts, everyone's exposed, but there are certain people that are more sensitive to that exposure. And then those groups have less ability to bounce back when they are exposed. And so that's a real public health issue at the intersection of these events. And so I wanted to say that. But the good news is, and I always say this, as we do know what to do about the climate crisis, there are three baskets of solutions: mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse emissions, and that's what's happening. There are talks at COP27 right now. But the reality is there will need to be an adaptation space as well, because we know that things are already happening. And so in places like London, England, that hit 104 degrees this year, 85% of those homes don't have air conditioning. So that's a health threat. And so we have to go back and adapt those houses. When we talk about flooding, one of the things that I'm working with Catherine Coleman Flowers right now on a large project, when we get these extreme rain events, they overwhelm septic and wastewater systems, as we saw in Jackson, Mississippi this year. And that wastewater and septic system can lead to health issues. And so we need to think about ways of engineering structures and engineering developments with nature-based solutions, as well as engineered solutions. But I was talking earlier to someone, because I know Rowen is really looking at nature-based solutions as a part of its development. Also, the Georgia Climate Project here in Georgia. I'm one of the principals of the Georgia Climate Project, which all of our universities are involved in. Drawdown Georgia, which has identified 20 or more so solutions that can reduce Georgia's climate emissions by the year 2030. So these consortiums of activities, the drawdown efforts, those are the areas of research where I have hope. And the last thing, I just tweeted before we walked up here all of our Twitter handles. And this is a part of the solution as well, because these are very important activities we have in our hallowed halls of our scholarly and ivory tower environments, UGA, Georgia Tech, and Emory. But we need to get the word out more broadly than that. So make sure to go to, I'm at Dr. Shepherd 2013, but I tweeted these two as well. Make sure you go and follow us, because we need to get this information out more broadly than this beautiful facility.
Okay. Our next question. And Cassie, this will be back to you. Much of the discussion around climate change reflects long-term impacts affecting our futures. What evidence are you seeing currently in your work that shows the effect of these changes today?
Thank you for that question. So part of my job as a medical ethnobotanist is to work with communities, including indigenous communities around the world, that are deeply entrenched with nature. They have a relationship with nature that I would guess that most of us in this room simply don't have. And I think that's one issue that Rowen can do a lot on, is helping us restore that interaction with nature. Some of the things that we're already seeing, and I'm going to pass these around, have a little show and tell, are changes in flowering patterns. So these are herbarium specimens. These are dried specimens of plants that are collected in the wild. They contain data on the location and date that they're collected. And at Emory, we have specimens going back to the 1800s. Now, there are older specimens going back into, especially in Europe, that can go back 500 and even 600 years. And so this offers an incredible opportunity for us to examine changes not only in where plants occur in the wild, but also how their phenology or their flowering and fruiting times are changing. And they are changing. This has been documented over and over again. Now, some of the questions that I ask people when I'm performing research with communities is really how are changes affecting their ability to secure food, whether it's through agriculture or foraging wild foods, and how is this affecting their medical care? Because while we may not use plants in our day-to-day medicine, the reality is that billions of people around the globe are solely reliant on wild plants as their main source of medicine. It's estimated that 80% of people living in developing nations rely solely on plants as medicine. What they are telling me at the ground level is that it's becoming more and more difficult to source these plants, or that the habitats in which these plants are either disappearing because of changes in land use practices, emergence of more and more monocropping industrial agriculture, or simply they're running out of mountain, right? So there have been amazing studies done in the Himalayas where scientists have documented that plants that were once found at elevations closer to where human settlements were are now gradually moving up the mountain. The challenge becomes what happens when those crops or those wild plants run out of mountain, right? So we have to think about how to use this data to foster more resilience in these food and medical systems. And this is something I'd love to see Rowen get involved with.
Thank you. Run out of mountain. I haven't heard of that one. Okay. Jonathan, what are the battles that the next generation will have to deal with at the intersection of health and the warming world?
I think we need to back up the question just a smidge. I think we were talking about managing climate change in public health for the next generation. I think we need to move towards mitigation for the next generation after that, the grandchildren going down the line, and trying to figure out systems, because some of these things are pretty easy to talk about in a warming world, more heat. So that would be one of those battles that we're going to be talking about. Marshall talked about London hitting 104. Well, earlier this summer, we also had Sacramento hit 116, breaking records by a couple degrees that they had never seen before. Seattle was a point where earlier this summer, they also had the world's worst air quality. Those two things in a warming system, we need to prepare for, and trying to mitigate the effects of the heat on the human body, and preparing for heat exhaustion, that sort of thing. And then also coming up with better systems in a warming world for handling the water that comes down, because systems are, again, producing more and more water. So those are two battles. We also have to realize that in a warming world, that sea level is rising, and that's happening now. We saw that with a hurricane a couple of weeks ago on the Atlantic coast, as I mentioned. We have to realize that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of communities on the coast in the United States, of course, thousands around the world, that are going to be battling the ocean. A colleague of mine asked, that is a Latina immigrant, and she asked, isn't it the American dream to have a house on the coast or a house on the beach? My response was that no, today it is the ocean's dream to have a house on the beach. And that is becoming more and more true. And we see that right now, Fort Myers is trying to rebuild themselves and trying to do that smart. And that is going to be a conversation for decades, where communities are literally going to have to rethink how they exist on the coastline. And that is, again, happening now. We're talking about current projections are, we're going to see a foot rise in water in today's generation. And we got to think about a couple of generations down the line. You can do the math there. But battles are going to be expanding quickly, and there's going to be battles. I mean, talk about public health. A couple of years ago, we weren't talking about COVID. In the warming world, we're going to start talking about different diseases and that sort of thing, and how those change, because in a warming world, we talk about during the winter, COVID and the flu becomes more prevalent during the winter. Warming world, we start talking about not having as much possible opportunity for spread of those things, but we're going to have other things pop up. We have to talk about those diseases or those possibilities years down the road. So we have a lot of challenges, and we have a lot of challenges. I think the biggest challenge perhaps is trying to figure out what those challenges that we don't know about decades down the road.
Thank you. Glad I didn't buy that house on Cape May Point, New Jersey. Yeah. Marshall, this one's for you. Rowen is a multi-generational project, as we heard Mason talk about, and it could take 30 to 50 years to achieve its full potential. What can we do now to protect the land we steward while creating opportunities to drive innovation that will get us closer to improving the health of our world and its inhabitants?
It's a great question. I think I alluded to some of it when we talked about this idea of engineering our infrastructure with nature-based solutions. I think that just standard engineering won't be the only way out of this. We have to reduce our climate emissions, our greenhouse emissions. That's one of the unsung public, I think I lost my mic, so I'll speak a little. One of the unsung sort of impacts of public health, and we just published on this in the Lancet, me and a couple of colleagues just a few months ago, the impact of hurricanes on cancer treatment. And what I mean by that is many of our healthcare facilities are temporarily, or in some cases long-term, shut down or damaged by extreme hurricanes and rainfall events. And that's an aspect of public health that often gets lost in the discussion. And so when we think about forthcoming infrastructure, we have an opportunity to develop them, and I know that Rowen's thinking strongly about this, develop them with more resiliency and sustainability in mind, but we also have a chance to develop new infrastructure with the climate in mind. Much of the carbon emissions associated with human activities related to buildings, and we can make our buildings more sustainable and more carbon emission friendly. And so I challenge all of our institutions to think carefully about sort of development of new resources and infrastructure, because that's what it's going to take. When we did our Drawdown Georgia analysis, and I encourage you all, if you're not familiar with Drawdown Georgia, take a look at the website. We have quite a bit of work done there. We also now have a greenhouse gas tracker that you can go and look at the carbon emissions in every county in the state and look at what are the sources within those counties of carbon. And you can start to understand the areas where we need to really strategically focus our efforts in mitigation. So, 20, 30 years out into the time horizon for the Rowen development, I think in that time, I think in the time that Rowen is starting to groundbreak, and I think he said December, in December you'll be groundbreaking. I think you're developing at a potential crossroads. In 30 years, we can be in a significantly dire situation if we don't start to reverse our carbon emission trends, or if entities like Rowen start to change the tide from the corporate business and sort of a federal NGO perspective. We all have to be all hands on deck. And I think when you have organizations like Rowen leading the way, it has more of a powerful voice than sort of this climate scientist standing before Congress or in the White House, which are things that I have to do from time to time. I'm often seen as a sort of a biased source, if you will, because I'm a climate scientist. Of course, I'm concerned about the climate. But when you have the business environment and development environment and the military and faith-based organizations engaged, that moves the needle with policymakers, frankly, more than my voice.
We have a final question, and I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to address it. And Jonathan, we'll start right down the row, okay? Youth engagement at Rowen will be critical, as the foundation we build today will support the next generation of leaders. From your perspective, what actions can our students take now to engage in the work ahead to address these issues?
Climate change is often thought of as a discussion for tomorrow, things we can do tomorrow. Climate change is happening now. And I think education is the first place to get that needle to move in the next direction. But everything, I think a lot of people think that climate change, we have to fix things right now. And yeah, there's definitely some urgency, as I just said. But we don't have to make these giant sweeping changes as a group right now. Each one of us can make a small change. The next car, think about the next car and coming up with a more gas efficient vehicle. I realize that's not for everyone. Well, I'm talking to on a college campus, everyone's dealing with student loans. So that's not optional for some folks. But taking the bus every once in a while, taking a friend to work with you the next day. Look for small changes that you can make to start that change. And just think about it each day. What can we do today? And most of those changes are small, but add up to all of us take part in that.
I would second everything that Jonathan just said, but I think we also need to engage our youth. And I know that there are plans to engage youth within Rowen. And another hat that I wear, I sit on Gwinnett County's inaugural Sustainability Commission that was stood up by the Gwinnett Board of Commissioners. And one of the first recommendations I made to that group and to the county commissioners is we need to add a K-12 student to this commission. Because they literally are going to bear the brunt of this, and they have voices. I sit on the campus of the University of Georgia, and they are leaders, irrespective of their political perspectives, cultural marinades and biases and so forth. I see engagement around this issue, and so we have to nurture that as opposed to sort of being in our sort of traditional positions of seniority and authority. We have to engage and let them lead, but they shouldn't have to be the leaders. As much as it's important that we have the Greta Thunbergs and students of the world, they shouldn't bear the brunt of our negligence. We have to also provide support and engagement in that and partner with them as well. So that's where I see the use. Of course, engagement. I mean, as much as it's important for us to look at the cars that we drive and perhaps our diets to reduce carbon emissions and so forth, those are incremental solutions. And I talked about this in a TED talk that I gave a few years ago. We are going to need transformational approaches to solve this crisis. The incremental will help, but it won't be enough. And so we have to have climate engaged voters, and we have to expose them to that process. Again, we don't need to tell them how to vote, but they need to understand that the actions in the political cycle will in fact move us forward in things like infrastructure bills, reduction of carbon emissions and so forth.
I guess I would say from my perspective, I have this incredible opportunity to teach hundreds of undergraduates here at Emory every year. And I'm every year impressed by their sense of dedication and activism. I'm also impressed by this blossoming desire that many of them express with a desire to become more connected to the earth. I think that in the classroom, we often teach students the theory behind sustainable agriculture or the theory behind, healthy cooking, but the actual implementation often is something that they just don't know how to go about. And so this is something we've also discussed in the climate task force, is this idea of moving towards more community engagement, of active learning in partnership with communities. I mean, Atlanta is an incredible place. We have so many opportunities to engage in community gardens. We have the edible food forest at Browns Mill. We have organizations like Concrete Jungle. We have organizations really all across the city that are raising awareness around this need to address food insecurities in the urban environment by bringing foods to communities. I'd love to see more of that. And I think that students would really benefit from that, because getting your hands in the earth and making that connection to where your food comes from, it can have a life-changing effect. And this is not limited, obviously, to college students. I'm talking about K through 12 as well. It also is incredibly empowering. We discussed anxiety. We discussed a sense of hopelessness that some people feel because it's such a big problem. How can I, as one person, do anything? I think engaging in activities like this can show each and every one of us that there is a way that you could make a difference. And it may be a small difference one by one, but together it becomes, really impactful.
Thank you. I like that. Together, one by one,
Mm-hmm.
and together. Mason, we have a few. Good. Any questions from or comments from the audience?
Okay, sorry. My name is Richard. I'm at Rowen School of Public Health as Humphrey Fellow from Tanzania, East Africa. I have one question. Actually, it's not direct a question, but I was thinking this kind of global perspective, like how the climate change does impact the world, and how do we go about it? Studies show like the most of developing countries, like my country, Tanzania, don't have like a number of emissions, don't produce emissions, but we are very much affected by the climate change. And we know most of these developing countries, we have limited resources, and we have a number of challenges when it comes to public health in issues, diseases. We have tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS. And when this climate change comes in, it's like the limited resources we have then again to concentrate on climate change, and we leave apart the challenges like the diseases and all that, which, so the climate change does bring a lot of problems, and sometimes we don't concentrate on the area that will help the people in terms of eradication of disease. Then we come to the climate change issues and all that. So my question is, how do we work at the global international diversity, and how are we going to work on collaborating with developing countries to make sure that the impact of climate change does not bring more effect to the developing countries? Thank you.
It certainly was a large conversation at COP27. Marshall?
Well, that's been the sticking point in the global conversation for almost a decade, because we know that countries like yours, Tanzania, have a minuscule carbon footprint, but bear a disproportionate brunt of the impact. Same thing here in the U.S. Folks over off of MLK in Southwest Atlanta are not producing as much carbon as those of us that drove in from Gwinnett County. I drove in an electric vehicle here, at least this morning, but you know, there are certainly these sort of issues of disparities. So one of the things that I think we have to do, because in developing countries, one of the things that's happening is that things that we talked about that would happen in the climate world are starting to happen. We're starting to see climate refugees in terms of food production is declining, and so people are having to leave their countries. We're starting to see people move into different parts of Europe, and that causes destabilization, immigration issues, and conflict. We're starting to see sea level rise displace people. We saw Hurricane Maria displace people in our own country in terms of at least our citizens in Puerto Rico's U.S. territory, and displace many people to parts of Florida. And so we know that there is a disparity there. The question is, are countries going to have the political will to say, we have to allocate some of our resources and technology for these countries without any return? What I mean by that, there's been a sticking point. Well, you know, who gets this? Well, I can't afford that. We know that we're impacting those countries, but we can only sort of allocate a certain amount of resources. That approach won't work. We know that we have to sort of step forward as a global community for countries like yours. We know it. We have to have the internal ethics to understand that it's just the right thing to do.
Thank you. Yes.
Can you hear me? Hi, my name is Dr. Vijaya Kanchella. I'm from School of Public Health here. Thank you so much for educating us on very important aspects of climate change. We commonly hear infectious diseases, but I'm a maternal child health epidemiologist, and there is evidence that heat is also impacting reproductive health of mothers, and downstream, like next generations, we'll see a lot more birth defects, prematurity, all of these associated with increasing heat waves. So just wanted to put it out there. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
But the long-term chronic exposures to higher levels is going to be important. We also failed to mention some of the impact of forest fires and the management of our forests. I think in many cases in the US, our forests have been abandoned. whereas historically they were managed actively by indigenous peoples that originated in those lands. And so when we think about how do we address heat, how do we address fires and pollution, I think we need to find solutions that not only integrate AI and high-tech technologies, but also look at some of the wisdom that's been passed down through indigenous land managements and ways to help build communities that can deal with that level of heat. And there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from groups around the world that do live in areas of high heat and have historically.
Can you hear me? With respect to equity, the way the Global addressed the ozone hole seems to be listed as a success. Are there lessons in that we can learn to better coordinate?
Yeah. So I think we tackled one molecule back then. We're still tackling that now. Recently, the discussion has all been about carbon dioxide. And now I think we're starting to see a shift, at least towards methane, a little bit more of a more potent molecule. I think the source of the ozone hole was such a relatively small issue. It was coming from one thing we all had in our house. I think that the topic is much bigger when we're talking about climate change, because everybody is making carbon dioxide, and we all have to do our own part. I think that's a much bigger issue, even though we're still dealing with the ozone hole fusion.
Yeah, I would add to that the Montreal Protocol, which essentially was the international agreement that helped us get over the sort of chlorofluorocarbon hump, if you will. You're right. It was a more singular directed problem. But even at that time, if you go back though and think about it, I was younger at the time, but I understand there was still ozone hole denial in the same way that we have climate change denial. I will say this, and I have my ear to the ground. The climate change denial is subsiding. I mean, it gets a lot more play than it deserves. There's something called the Six Americas study that Yale Climate Communication does every year. And there's a sixth group out of that Six Americas study called the and that group is about I'm going to take this off. That group is about 7%. So you think that there's more climate denial than there is. But they're just the loudest on Twitter, or they're that uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner that said, hey, I YouTube this, here's what I think. You know, that's classic Dunning-Kruger effect, by the way. So we can't sort of let that 7% dismissive crowd dominate. Look, I testified before Congress a couple of years ago on this, both sides of the aisle, and very reasonable questions came from both sides of the aisle. So I want to sort of, even in this state, quietly, the state of Georgia is becoming a leader in EV production, EV infrastructure, solar. So there's sort of a narrative out there, and then there's the reality of what's going on. So sort of kind of try to remove the noise and stay focused on the signal. Yeah, we still have some work to do in some circles, but there's a lot more movement in this space. And I think Rowen can help lead us, because it's a clear leader in this state in terms of sustainable development. And I think, you know, people that well above my pay grade, again, as I made this point earlier, will take notice of what Rowen is doing.
Yes.
Hello? All right. So a common theme which was mentioned throughout this entire speech was the youth and sharing the information. And also, Dr. Marshall, you mentioned Twitter, spreading the word. So I'm curious, we're all in industry, we're all working for infrastructure. We all want to do alternative resources. We want to do as much as we can. But my question is, for the younger generations, what are some of the ways which we can incentivize them, or we can kind of bridge the gap so they're more informed and more involved, especially because maybe they're healthy, maybe they may not understand it. They're coming into a new world, which is drastically going to be different from the world we live in now. What are some of the ways which we can spread the word to them, make it a constant part of their lifestyle, not just an immediate thing in a class for a short period of time, but throughout their entire life? What are some of the ways we can incentivize them and really spread the word so it's part of the way that they operate as people?
There's a real low-hanging fruit answer to that. Get on TikTok. I have a first-year college student and a 10th grader in high school. I'm serious. That's where they can. They don't watch the news. They don't watch CNN. They don't watch local news. They constantly watch TikTok, and I'm serious. And so I actually I'm very engaged in social media. I'm very technically savvy. I'm not that academic that says I don't do that new stuff like Twitter. Newsflash, it's not new. It's been around for a while. First of all, we've got to engage. I'm quoted as saying, if we in the ivory tower don't engage broadly, people with ideas other than what people need to hear will certainly fill that gap that we leave behind. So I reluctantly got on TikTok because I saw so much misinformation out there, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to cultivate a movement. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Don't Look Up. I was one of the science advisors for that movie. And in addition to the movie, Don't Look Up, the producers have a website, an entire science community where you can go and engage and find out ways. So those are some of the other solutions. I bet my colleagues have other thoughts.
Yeah, I'll talk into that for a minute. I think we also need to leave our phones behind and talked about getting out and digging in the ground. I think we need to have a conversation, especially in schools, where we're leaving the classroom, getting out of the buildings at work, and actually going and seeing some of the change, because again, it is happening now. And here in Atlanta, we can talk about air quality and along the coastline, go out and see where the coastline used to be. And I think we need to just get away from some of the news rhetoric that we see and actually talking and actually doing some actual hands-on work in this space.
I also think we could do a much better job of showcasing all the exciting jobs that are coming out in this field. You know, I'm a mom of a college student, 2 high schoolers, and an elementary school student. So I've got the full range, right? And it's amazing to me that they're not really being exposed to all the different ways that they can engage in the future of sustainable business, of sustainable engineering, design. I think there's a lot of great opportunities out there, and maybe some of the things that we can do is bring this into job fairs in high schools, show people, and in colleges, and even in elementary schools. Like, let's show them the incredible potential that training in these fields can lead to, because that can be a path towards a bright, independent economic future for individuals. But I think the awareness just isn't there yet.
I want to give a very specific recommendation to the Rowen folks in the room, because again, I live in Gwinnett County, and and maybe you're already aware of it, but there's a facility in Gwinnett County called JR BizTown, based at Discovery High School. Essentially, every student in the Gwinnett County public school system, at least, and perhaps even other schools, go to that. And it teaches them basic business and personal finance in a hands-on way. Wouldn't it be interesting to partner with them in such a way to integrate sustainable business development into those lessons?
Good idea.
Love that. Thank you. Dr. Sakawa, I'm going to just segue to you, since you just got back from Egypt, and we had a group of students leading a conversation at COP27. Based on the student conversations, did you hear anything that would contribute to this part of the conversation?
Thank you. There are actually students that are here, so I would love to hear them speak about those. We had a side event where we were actually able to have a lot of global climate youth leaders that came about to say like what they could do, but they're also seeing a lot of barriers because of the formal powers that are not allowing the youth give the voices. And I would love to hear from the youth that were at the COP if you have any recommendations that you would like to see happen.
Hi, my name is Kashish Kalwani. I'm a grad student at Laney Graduate School, and I'm studying Master's in Development Practice. And so my journey with climate change, it's like I've lived in 5 countries, traveled to many more, And this opportunity to go to COP27 was really very different than what I expected. I thought I'll be on top of it, like, attending every negotiation stuff, but then most of the learning happened inside events and from different booths and pavilions that I attended. My area of interest has also been in a very indigenous approach to climate change, especially using meditation as a tool to connect with yourself and addressing root causes of what is your mindset, why is there greed, why is there a lot of maybe passion to make changes, but we forget about compassion then. And so I saw many faith communities right there in the conference talking about where people do not trust many organizations, foundations, but they will trust their church and tell them what to do the right thing. And how can we leverage the trust there to invest in climate change? So that was a very interesting point for me to take away from it.
Thank you. Other comments? Yes, sir.
My name is Sam Hampton. I've been associated with agriculture most of my life. And one of my big concerns is the destruction of our soil in this nation. I don't think we give it the priority, the importance that it should be receiving. I want to reinforce the connectivity issue. We are not connecting. First of all, academia and institutions like this is wonderful. But there's also a form of academia from a farmer who's farmed 40 years, who's had his ups and downs and his hands in the soil. And regarding the soil, I have, in my readings in the last year, I have been fascinated by the amount of biological activity that exists in the soil. And I think we're destroying that in numerous ways. And I think we're going to pay the price in years to come. The soil has an ability to recuperate if we will work with it and not work against it. Our soil can pull minerals out of the deep areas of the ground that we cannot conceive of. We look at a weed and we say, let's get rid of it. What can we spray it with? In the process of spraying for that weed, we're killing biological activity in the soil. So we decrease our organic matter. And when we decrease our organic matter in the soil, we're also decreasing the ability of that soil to absorb water. So we have tremendous water runoff, which floods the Mississippi and every river in this country. And we say, well, let's build a dike. Let's build something that will contain that water. Let's put more emphasis in helping the soil absorb that water to refill our aquifers that are deep down in this earth. And I think the average person is missing a lot of this knowledge. I've just, it's become an issue with me because it fascinates me. And I don't have a specific question other than ways of, creating that more of that connection between the knowledge we have and what's actually being implemented in our daily lives.
I'm going to hand this off, but I would quickly, I think that's one of the things that some of the engineering with nature solutions are trying to do. And what you were just talking about really is a manifestation of the nitrogen and biogeochemical cycles, the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle. And so we sort of know the importance of those organisms in the soil and everything that you just eloquently talked about. And so I think we would all violently agree with you.
Yeah.
Subdivisions, and they go in there and they destroy or they remove the topsoil and they grade it beautifully around these new houses, and then they bring in sod. I mean, it's gotten to the point where we cannot toss out seed in our yards in subdivisions and have them germinate because we've eliminated the topsoil.
I think cultivation of soil is a huge issue. Thank you for bringing this up. There are innovations now with the field of farming called regenerative farming that really focuses on trying to cultivate that rich soil. Our whole system of agriculture has drastically changed in the past century. You know, where we moved away from small family farms to larger monocropping, we have now dumped kilotons of agrochemicals into our soils as herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. With the warming climate, we're now also seeing more and more emergence of fungal pathogens that originate in the soil, right? But with constant spraying with fungicidal agents, those are becoming resistant to the few drugs that we have to treat these fungal infections that get into our bloodstreams. We're also seeing now the spraying of antibiotics, not just antibiotics in our livestock rearing, but also in plants. As I mentioned, I'm from Florida. Our greatest export, besides cattle, is oranges. We have very little genetic diversity in our orange stalks. And my town has been decimated by a disease known as greening. It is citrus greening is a bacterial infection that gets into orange trees. Now, the solution from the state of Florida has been, well, let's spray the trees with oxytetracycline. Treat this bacterial infection. Number one, we don't know if this is even going to work. And number two, you're now dumping a lot of antibiotics into the environment that are going to have ill effects on the farmers and on the community. And that's going to stay in the soil. So we've been putting a lot of agrochemicals in the soil without really understanding the long-term consequences of that. And I think this is something that Rowen can do a lot with this landscape, is really, you know, pulling out agricultural test plots to work with regenerative farming techniques. And let's bring back some diversity to our agricultural systems, because we are also facing, by the way, if you don't know about this, the loss of the banana. The Cavendish banana is on its way out because of a fungal disease. Anyone ever heard of the Big Mike banana, Grand Michel? Never heard of it? That was the big banana in the 1950s, but we lost that to a fungal infection as well because there's no genetic diversity in the way that we rear our bananas. So we see this over and over again, and yet we're not quite getting the message that we need diversity. We need to take care of our soil and our environment. So thank you, sir, for bringing that up, and thank you for your farming. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
All this talk of fungus and mold reminds me of Mold the Musical. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but we recently had it here. It started in the UK. It's about Fleming and antibiotics and how the use in the environment. I didn't realize that the bottoms of ships, they spray now with antibiotics to keep the, yes. And so it's in our oceans, our rivers. I mean, everything that we've just talked about, and in new and horrible ways. And Fleming himself, who came up with penicillin, warned the world that if we weren't careful with antibiotics, that we were going to cause antibiotic resistance. And now there are tens of millions of people dying of antibiotic resistance today.
So before we wrap up, we're going to transition the conversation just a little bit, but I want to end the panel on, it's been fascinating. Hopefully on a note of encouragement. Where do you find, I'd like to hear from each panelist, where do you find hope in the future? Where do you find an opportunity for what we need to accomplish? We have to address it. There's so many challenges that we're walking through now. Where do you find hope? Where do you see where we can work together and find a lift?
I'll go ahead and start. I think that this topic, both in the weather fields and in medicine, we have a tremendous opportunity for engineering. We have a tremendous opportunity for ingenuity and for creating jobs from both of these sectors. And some of these things we can't even think of right now. We're thinking of new jobs, new positions, and that's a fascinating way to attack this problem going forward. And I think, Rowen, with the opportunity for a very different type of space is a great way to attack this going forward.
And I two answers. One, the youth, because I think they really will help us sort of shift this sort of generational marinade that has held us back so far. I mean, I talk in a book I wrote recently about marinades, and that we all have these marinades that we've been soaking in all of our lives. And I think we're sort of starting to see our marinades and our generation and the generation before us, that marinade has held us back, but this current marinade the youth are coming up in will help us. But the other thing is, and this is going to be a very non-academic answer, I think what gives me hope is organizations like Rowen and other organizations are starting to understand and distribute and sort of disseminate that we can have a successful sort of business model and practice that's sustainable. Ray Anderson talked about this and sort of led the charge on this many years ago with interface carpets. But I think we're starting to see a generation of corporations understand that sustainable business and profit making is a thing. It's possible. And that gives me hope.
I mean, I second their comments. And I would just say that I think in addition to the youth and these emerging economic models, I think what gives me hope is it seems that there's been a change in the tide where we're starting to listen more to Indigenous voices. I think that we have to pay attention to these lessons learned over centuries. Often these things are considered anecdotes or old wives' tales. Why do you take care of the soil this way? Or why do you plant this plant and then this one after? It's actually rationale behind that. And it's, knowledge that's been generated over centuries and passed down from grandparent to grandchild over and over and over again. And I think I'm given hope by recognizing that more and more people are starting to listen to that. They're starting to see the value in that. And hopefully we can take some of those lessons and implement them with organizations like Rowen.
Well, you give us all hope. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, it's fascinating. Thank you again to our panelists, Dr. Bruner, and for leading the way. I'd like to take just a couple minutes as we think about Rowen, and I'd mentioned we are breaking ground in December and have gone through almost 2 years of work with our engineers, thinking about everything from stormwater to the landscaping and creating not monocultures, but places that bring back a diversity of biohabitat as a part of what we will develop getting into the site. But I'd love to hear from the group. We've been having a great conversation between everyone. But what areas could Rowen focus on in thinking about convergence? I'm especially excited about the idea of multiple institutions coming together. Georgia Gwinnett College and the great work that they're doing in Gwinnett alongside Emory as we think about health and impact. So just an open dialogue. Would love ideas from people to suggest, make recommendations around applications we can help champion at the Rowen Foundation or be a catalyst for, or literally a living laboratory and actually test some things on the property and see what we can learn together. So any thoughts to that?
And making that a voice.
That's great. Finance. I mean, we hear this from companies as we talk about having 100% renewable energy within the Rowen property. That is attracting the companies that see that as a value, as a part of not just a nice to have, but a must have, and they think about their global responsibility. But how do we finance it so it's a sustainable approach and is scalable? Other thoughts? That's exactly the kind of direct input that's really helpful thinking about finance. Yes.
One thought, like, what is the reach of your organization? Are you focusing in Georgia, or do you think you could expand? Because there are a lot of scientists working on it, especially in public health. But I like the idea of you being the hatchery there, right? But how far can we expand global? How can we bring all these thought leaders together? I know NIH has a stream for climate research, but these are extremely competitive grants. They could have 10 awesome proposals, but only one gets selected. So we are throwing out 9 good ideas. So how can we generate this into practice?
So great question. We have a global vision for the impact that we want to have. Our home is in Gwinnett County. Our home is in Metro Atlanta. Our home is in Georgia. But our reach, our vision, the impact that we want to have, and I would say the table that we want to create at Rowen really is global, because those challenges are global, and we need to be able to transfer those solutions and ideas and those opportunities to partner to be globally minded. So that is very much how we're thinking. And I love the idea, having one winner, but there's all these great ideas that maybe did not receive funding, and how could we perhaps seed those through a partnership with the foundation and giving them a home to take root. That's a wonderful. What was the program you had mentioned? The 1 of 9? NIH.
But
okay.
yeah, but there could be other ones as well.
That's great. Yes. There you go.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, some of my own medicine. There are many other opportunities, but one I want to mention that really takes a huge collaborative. So having something unique and novel like Rowen, that would be the convener of the multiple universities doing fabulous work in this area. These grants are coming out called ARPA-H, and they're around very sustainable, equitable public health solutions to big problems. And so we know that everything from you can imagine all the asthma and other health implications of climate change. I think that our university partners would have a great opportunity, because these are big out of the box grants. These are things that they would say that if you send it to the NIH and they said it was too ambitious, then you should go to ARPA-H. But these are multi-institution, multi-unique partnerships that they're looking for with a big vision, not incremental little, just not that they're little, but incremental discoveries like the way the NIH does. But ARPA-H is a tremendous opportunity that I think that we should be thinking about collectively.
Completely agree. Yes, please.
Hey, thank you so much for that opportunity to comment and to learn. I'm really interested to hear what you all are thinking at the convergence of medicine, particularly. I'm a pediatrician. I sit on the executive committee for the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Environmental Health and Climate Change, and I'm our liaison to the HHS Decarbonizing Healthcare Initiative. I'm also on the task force Dr. Bruner mentioned. I'm really appreciating this discussion, and as a pediatrician, the emphasis on youth and on health. And I think one way that we can engage our youth is, my dream is for every pediatrician in well child visits. Most kids still see a pediatrician, to talk to them about the ways that climate change is creating challenges for their health, and also how they can protect themselves. We still have children who die in Georgia on playing fields in hot weather and extreme heat. That's something that we can prevent and talk about in every single sports physical that we do in the pediatrics office. But there's an opportunity here too. I think we're seeing kind of the limits of healthcare that focuses on treating disease. And we heard a lot about transformations and transformations needed. There's an opportunity to talk about wellness and how we promote health and all the things that we need to do to promote health that are part of the solution for climate change. So I'm excited to hear what you all are thinking in that field of medicine.
That's great. And do you have any comments there? I have a few thoughts. Dr. Shepherd had mentioned the Discovery High School, and how could we integrate perhaps this education about the environment, about their personal health and advocating for themselves perhaps at times, and just what those implications mean. But certainly something very important with us for Rowen, and what I'd love to do is make that connection like at a high school where we can start planting some of that programming.
Well, and I want to make it clear, the high school program I mentioned, Discovery, is not focused on Discovery High School. It serves the Gwinnett County. That facility is just based in Discovery High School, but the entire Gwinnett County feeds it. They send students there daily. And so it's a risk called JA BizTown. It's set up like a town. It's a large town. So I could envision one of the stops as the students traverse through JA BizTown being in sort of corporate sustainability that Rowen sponsored, because they have sponsors. And
That's great. Are there any programs specifically as a pediatrician kind of leading in that field that you've seen that would be interesting for us to look at and learn as well?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to understand, is there interest in how will Rowen engage? Sorry, stand back. I imagine there's not going to be delivery of healthcare, but I think part of it is looking at the where people are living, how people are bringing together built environment, how that interfaces with the natural environment. There's all sorts of opportunities, but I'm so curious to hear what you all are thinking about medicine specifically. I talk a lot in our group about the idea of flipping the exam room, and I know I can treat asthma with my eyes closed. All of our residents can at the end of their first year. But if we send that child back out into the world where pollution is harming their health, where maybe it's pollen and this more allergenic pollen is triggering it again, without even talking about those implications, have we really helped that child? So that's kind of the transformation potential I see here.
I was going to add, could I add to that real quick? So I just, again, in the class I mentioned that I just taught this semester, I just was teaching about urban carbon domes. And so urban environments like we're sitting in right now, although this is a very fairly green campus, are sort of natural laboratories for allergens, not only because of the excess heat due to the urban heat island, but also the excess carbon. And so these are things that can sort of exacerbate very allergy and asthma conditions. Something else I'm going to drop on you as a healthcare professional and a doctor. We've been studying something that's somewhat counterintuitive called thunderstorm asthma. And you may have seen some discussion of this. When it rains heavily, we have some studies have shown, and some colleagues here at Emory, Paige Tolbert Pryorly and Stephanie Sarnat have been involved in that work. When it rains heavily, we see upticks in emergency room visits for asthma, because what happens is the rainfall breaks the pollen into smaller aeroallergens that can penetrate the lungs, but then the wind from the thunder, you know how it gets windy after when it's raining, a thunderstorm, it disperses those aeroallergens further out into the metro area. And so we know that rain intensity is increasing as a response to climate change. So I've been concerned about an uptick in this thunderstorm asthma occurrences. So I think those are opportunities in literature that is given. I have kids that are given out to pediatricians. I wonder if there's sort of large scale programs that where I know that there's literature often given out in pediatrician visits. Is there a pamphlet that can be given out on impacts of climate on your particular condition? I don't know if that exists, if there's a grant program that could stand it up, or Rowen or someone can initiate a pilot prototyping effort to sort of see if it works.
I love the prototype idea. That's where my mind was going, was a place-based opportunity to actually have that live out, where we can bring the people that know much, much more about our children and our climate and our environment that could be in Rowen to provide access and information outside of the exam room. And learn. One second, Dr. Joseph, I just wanted to grab.
A quick comment on pollen. Thank you. Because there is an intersection between medicine and urban planning.
Yeah.
If you look at the landscapes around Atlanta, most of our landscaping is done with non-native species. These are species that are often highly allergenic, and they don't provide any benefit to communities other than some with shade and beautification. There are lots of beautiful native species to the southeast, including edible trees, fruit trees that could be planted. And this is something that I think should be incorporated into planning at Rowen, is thinking about how do we bring in species that are native, plant those, make sure that they're useful in different ways to people. Why not make food free and available? like with this kind of edible forest.
It's great. And I'm smiling up here because Bob Hughes walked in, who leads HGOR. Put your hand up, Bob. He's goes way back with the Rowen Foundation. And we've had these conversations in his mind, thinking about how do we use the landscape, not as just something that's beautification, but as a resource that is an education opportunity. So just want to acknowledge Bob. Dr. Joseph.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. John Joseph, President, Georgia Gwinnett College. Always have to give some context to people who are not familiar with us. We are in the county of Gwinnett, for the county of Gwinnett, and by the county of Gwinnett. We were founded to support higher education in a rapidly growing county of about 1 million people right now, proud resident there myself. So what we are about on our campus is to find solutions. We were about innovation, we are about the future, and we represent the future. We are the most diverse campus in the Southeast region. We are a minority serving institution, we are Hispanic serving institution, and we are an APC institution. So we have multiple labels. But that's all for the point and beside the point in some ways, because I think one of the things I want us to keep thinking about and why I serve in Rowen is how we can actually develop in our classrooms that sort of an attitude and that presence of mind for the future. So one of the things that we are focused on is giving all of our students an experiential learning, something that they can all do. We are not a research institution. We can't go after those big grants, but we are about making sure that our students have access to doing the work of the future. So we see ourselves as part of the workforce for this project that would become 20, 30, 40 years from now. So we are always looking for opportunities for our students to get on the ground in their classrooms and have experiential learning. And I think this is where some of us are able to play in that new place between our collaborations with K-12 and our collaborations with the research institutions in our midst. How do we continue to find opportunities for our very large, diverse group of students, 11,000 students, to get on the ground in the field, because we know they are the future. They're the future, not just in age, they're the future in demographic. They are the leaders, and they're the people who are going to be working and establishing and continue to grow in Gwinnett County. So I'm really proud to serve in this capacity and in this community. And I really want us to continue to collaborate around not just the big grants, but on the practical day-to-day aspects of getting our young people involved in their own future. So thanks for comments and thanks for the panel and for all the opportunities to participate today.
Very well said, Dr. Joseph. We are thankful to have you on our board and helping us to bring Rowen to life. Any other comments for us to take away? We have a couple more minutes. This has been extremely helpful. This is direct input that our team is tracking down to integrate into our work. So welcome any final thoughts as we close things out. Yes, sir. Two more. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Actually, I was trying to think about the mental health issue. You know, it was a little bit talked about during the discussion by the panelists, but I think we need to find a way like to integrate, to come in with the organizations or whatever that are working on mental health. We know how climate change does impact people. And when you talk about depression, anxiety, it's one of the common things to mental health, especially to the youth. So we need to collaborate with these organizations working on mental health to discuss about the climate change and how this does impact the people's mental health. So that would be an area for people to discuss about it and to know that everybody should get in to combat the climate change challenges so that you cannot get infected to that extent. Thank you.
It's very helpful. Thank you very much. Do you have a comment, sir? Please.
My name is Matt. I'm a undergraduate. I think I'm probably the youngest person here. And so I was most recently in high school, and I can say like with our generation now, going into high schools isn't really enough sometimes, because I mean, our generation with phones and everything, we just don't have the attention span. But the things that really engage us is getting us out of the classroom. Like I can say from my experience, being from Maryland, we took a trip to a tobacco plantation where we saw how like the tobacco farms are damaging the soil and how switching to soybeans more helpful. And I think that if Rowen really wants to engage the youth, it should look something maybe getting them out of the classroom, which could be hard for schools like in the city where they're not really close to a lot of nature stuff or people in lower socioeconomic status. But still, I think it's really interesting to not do the traditional setting in the classroom, go beyond that.
Great. Thank you very much. And our board is going to find out about this in a couple of hours, but we're proposing an idea of bringing together an advisory council. And I think as a part of that, thinking about how do we engage with students with those, coming out of high school and thinking creatively around what would be engaging and how can we use Rowen in a variety of ways, both for industry, for higher education, but also to get people out of the classroom and into that environment, I think is a really important step. Well, thank you again. This has been a wonderful afternoon. One more round of applause for Dr. Bruner, for the panelists. So appreciative for your time, both in being in here and contributing your intellect, but also your passion and conviction. I hope we go forward with a sense of hope, with a sense of responsibility that we all carry as individuals to address these challenges, and then come back together, support one another, challenge each other, and be able to chart a path forward. So I hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you again talking about Rowen and Emory. Thanks.